McCartney. I'm not Ken Bennett. I'm Trey Hargett. One of those who were there last night. Is Ken in the audience today? Ken did a great Paul McCartney for us last night. So, good morning. Welcome to the Asset Joint Session of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. As I said, I'm Trey Hargett, the President-elect of the National Association of Secretaries of State. I'm grateful to our current President, Ross Miller, Secretary of State of Nevada, for offering the opportunity to chair this session today. And I'm delighted that we have so many. We have the members of the commission here this morning, and we're excited they can be here. I can moderate this session, and to report this commission will issue their report in just a few months, I believe. Secretaries of State are also delighted to team up with NASCET in this session. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Michigan State Election Director and NASCET President Chris Thomas, who may be the second best coordinator elections in the country, behind Mark Lawrence from Tennessee, of course. But Chris wears many hats these days, including that of Presidential Commission member. He has an excellent reputation as a national expert on election administration, and we're extremely pleased that he will be offering his insight and his expertise with his fellow commissioners. I want to encourage you today, I want the audience to participate greatly. This is to maximize our interaction between us as election officials and the members of the Presidential Commission. I believe at the state level, we know how elections are run. We know we need to improve. We know we've done well. It's up to this body to share our best practices with the rest of the country and our colleagues around the country. Members of, as I said, the members of NASA and NASA have a great deal of information and expertise when it comes to the nuts and bolts of running elections in the United States. And gatherings like this are what allow us to share that knowledge. As many of you, NASA has already held a roundtable discussion on the November 2012 election, and our members met in Nevada for the exchange in May, and we're particularly honored that the Presidential Commission co-chairs traveled to that meeting to address our members. The goal of this gathering was to identify administrative successes and areas for improvement, as well as to help chief and state election officials benefit from the collective expertise that is available through NAS. A summary paper was developed from that discussion and will be shared with the Presidential Commission at the conclusion of this conference. Now, I do want to remind you today, we do have a videographer here from the blog. They are from mudflats.net. We welcome you to video today's session. He thought it was very impressive that we had members of the Presidential Commission here today, and so we share in that, and we thank you for your presence. Getting back to today's session, we are pleased and honored the Commission co-chairs Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg have once again joined us. In Bob Bauer's 30 years of legal practice, he has provided counseling and representation on matters involving regulation of political activity before the courts and administrative agencies of national party committees, candidates, political committees, and many others. He returned to his law firm after a period of service to President Barack Obama, serving as his White House counsel from December 2009 to June 2011. Mr. Bauer most recently served as General Counsel to the President's re-election committee in 2012, in addition to serving as General Counsel to the Democratic National Committee. His counterpart, Ben Ginsberg, is also a career attorney who represents numerous political parties, political campaigns, candidates, members of Congress, state legislatures, governors, and more. In both the 2004 and 2010 election cycles, Mr. Ginsberg served as General National Counsel to the Bush-Cheney presidential campaign. In 2008, he served as National Counsel to the Romney President campaign. He also serves as counsel to the Republican Governors Association, providing in-depth experience in state and legislative matters. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to ask both of you to give a few words of introduction and also maybe introduce your fellow members of the commission who are in attendance this morning.
Thank you. We'd be honored to. Thank you all very much for today. We find these sessions around the country, including the earlier one with NAS members in Las Vegas, to be absolutely crucial as well as highly informative to what our mission is from the President. I'm sure that you've seen the categories that the issues that the President asked the Commission to look at specifically. We have been traveling around the country, both hearings set by the Commission and convenings like this to meet with many of you. We do look at this, and Bob and I have sort of banged heads and ideas on different sides of many issues and recounts in front of some of you over the years. We will continue to do that, but the topics of the Presidential Commission are ones that really should not be partisan issues. So what we are doing on the commission is looking for best practices, for standards, taking the best of the things that all of you do in your states, and trying to spread that in a way we hope will be able to have some impact. To do that, the President has generously appointed a terrific commission for us to work with. There are 5 from the professional election administrator category and 3 from private industry. Joining us today is a terrific research director. On the right, Nate Persley, a professor of law and political science at Stanford University, who has a legendary grasp of the research in this area that we take advantage of on a regular basis. Tammy Patrick from Maricopa County, Arizona, who I know many of you know and work with. Chris Thomas, of course, the head of NASAD, Brother Bob here. Brian Britton. Brian joins us from the private sector. He is the director of theme parks at Disney companies. And so in addition to giving out free tours of Disney World over in the back after the show, he also brings to us something that is invaluable to us, which is a professional eye for the art and science of geology and handling lines and handling people. We have 3 people who are primarily involved in customer service side of the private sector. So joining Brian from there is Joe Echeverria, who is the president of Deloitte Touche, and Michelle Mays Coleman, who is currently the general counsel of the New York City Public Library, formerly the general counsel of Allstate Insurance. And also today is Larry Lomax, who I know many of you know as the longtime director of elections in Clark County, Nevada. So we have a commission with terrific ideas in and of itself to come up with what we hope will be practical solutions that combine what all of you tell us are the problems and the best practices with the admonitions that Nate has brought us, along with what we're spending a lot of time doing, which is listening to people who want to come tell us about their experience in elections and the sessions we're having around the country.
I'll be brief. Ben put the key points here very well. We find that we have a commission that is very committed to a dialogue with all the affected officials, people who in this so hard to believe in the great deal of thought, the people who've been studying in the academic community, and then, as you know, all of our public hearings are also devoted to what Ben calls open mic night, which is we hear from groups, we hear from interested voting rights advocates and other people in the community who represent the interests of voters, or who themselves are speaking to us as voters. And what we have discovered, I think, bears on what Ben has said, and I think what has been the President's belief about this, which is there is room in this country, as much as we hear about polarized politics, partisan politics in the United States, there is room in this country for a nonpartisan, thoughtful conversation about voting that skips past all the contentious debates we're all familiar with in the political sphere and really looks at these as matters of substance. We have discovered that people do, in your community and elsewhere, do want to discuss this. They are really eager to hear an exchange of ideas on the merits. And we encourage you today and also at the rest of the process to please give us your thoughts, your ideas, your criticisms, because we found that at this point it has really been a very open flow of information back and forth, and the views can be extraordinarily helpful. It's an issue of public administration to us. That's what it is, an issue of public administration, not of partisan politics, not of party politics, not any contemporary conflict over what the constitutional law of the land would be, but a fundamental question of how we in a country this size and sophistication can deliver to the voters the voting system state by state, understanding differences among states, what the voting system state deserves. So we welcome this opportunity, very grateful for this opportunity. It's fundamentally what the work of our commission is built around. So discussions like this, and of course, critically, the public hearings will continue around the country. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Chairman. Do our other members of the commission have any thoughts they want to share before we get moving along? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I just want to indicate that we're pleased that NASA had this committee meeting. I'm also very pleased to bring the commission up here to appear before you and hear what you all have to say. This room is really full of the expertise in terms of administering elections at the state level, and very much look forward to your insights and best practices and direction that we want to take things next.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. I appreciate your leadership in helping make today happen as well. And do either our chairman will talk about maybe what your timeline is and maybe what the public meeting schedule is from this point that you know of?
Sure. We have 3 more public hearings scheduled. The next one will be August 8th in Denver. The one after that will be September the 4th in Philadelphia. And then September 20th in either Cleveland or Cincinnati, still to be determined. And we will be attending any number of meetings over the course of the summer and September to try and get additional.
Okay, well, thank you.
And excuse me, any suggestions that you have of sessions that we should attend, we're also eager to hear.
Thank you. Bob?
One other, so I know many of you know this, but we see a number of you who are affiliated with some previous discussions, but just for those of you who may not have heard before, we have obviously a website up and running, www.supportthevoter.gov, and we have posted research materials to that site. We will post all public receipt materials to that site. And quite beyond the discussions and meetings that we're talking about, to the extent that there are, and we met just in the last 24 hours, who's interested in doing this, there are very specific submissions or notions that would like to provide data that would like to provide us. When I say data, our Professor Persky over here jumps out of his chair. We always get him to listen to you use the word data. And if you have it, if you have information that data you'd like to submit to us in writing for consideration, quite apart from resource gathering, these strongly welcome. And by the way, having said that, Secretary, do want to also be open to the other commissioners to say something.
Thank you, John Barrow. Anyone else?
Yeah, go ahead.
Since that was the clarion call for data, let me just give you all my email address. So I'm Nate Persman, I'm Professor at Stanford at Boston, and also the Great Research Director of the Commission. If you just put my last name into Google, you'll find it at nate.personally at supportthevoter.gov. That's NATE.PERSILY at supportthevoter.gov. The reason I'm giving it to you is I really hope that after this meeting, and we've had some luck in the previous meetings, in getting not just data, though we really want that, but as much information as you can share with the Commission on experiments that you've done, other types of studies that have come out of your state. We really would like to get as much before the Commission in the short time frame that we have, because the report is due in December. So whatever you can provide us by way of numbers or information, we welcome.
Thank you. Any other commissioners want to address anything right now? If we can, I'm going to move along. You know, recently, obviously, we all know there are issues that the president has to be addressed in executive order, and Nash recently sent out some questions. That's okay, thank you. Recently, Nash sent out some questions, and also we have note cards on the table. Is that correct? Okay, we'll get note cards out, so if you want to write questions down, we'll also have microphones in the middle of the room that we'll be able to use to ask questions as we move along. But, you know, when I look at these topics, there's a pretty big list, and that's a pretty tall order. And so, as we look through these, I'd ask the commissioners today, have you prioritized these in any way? I mean, do you see all these being co-equal, or there's some of them more important than others? And as you've had your public meetings already, what have you heard in relation to these? Either of you or anybody on the commission's fine.
Well, the president created the commission because of the long line of issues that occurred in the campaign. So we spent a great deal of time talking about that, actually on a pretty granular level with the local officials involved in it. But we welcome your comments. I think within that, we have not prioritized the issues. They're all important to a number of jurisdictions in a number of different ways. So for purposes of today, I think it'd be most helpful, Mr. Secretary, to run down the list. And there are a couple of emerging issues which I think we'd like to particularly highlight, which would be early voting and online registration, in which there are some interesting trends and differing views. But to go down the list and to get people's views on that would be excellent.
Okay, well, certainly we can proceed that way. Just looking at the top, it's a polling place management, including the number of location management, operation, design of polling places. I mean, I'd open up to the membership, people in the room, and see if you have any thoughts you want to share with the commissioners. I'll be honest, in Tennessee, we had a pretty smooth election. And I say pretty smooth, I'm trying to be conservative. I think it was a very smooth election. Obviously, I've read reports, maybe in a couple places in the country there, have been different issues. If you've had a positive experience with something, feel free to share that. If you've had a negative experience in ways that you're working on that, I want you to feel free to share that as well.
And the other, I guess, one of the phenomena we've seen in the line category is that the jurisdictions that had long lines also had a lot of places that didn't have long lines. And so why is it within your particular jurisdictions, one place would be absolutely jammed up with people waiting in line, while many others around that were not. So what was right in particular places and what was wrong and what needs to be improved there?
And if I could throw one other comment out here, or one other point that might stir up some comment, which we'd love to hear. We did hear from election officials not too long ago that when we use the phrase polling place management, for location, etc., we heard some stories that were backed up by a discussion of the structural reasons and the legal reasons why these stories come to pass about election officials literally just trying to find places to hold elections, just being unable to identify, that they were unable to obtain, and in some cases having obtained them in one election, losing them from the next, appropriate facilities in which to actually locate precinct polling places. And so, when we talk about location number of polling places, it means we all read things. Well, you just go out there and you identify the facilities that work best for you, and you design them in a way that makes the most sense. What we heard suggested that in some jurisdictions, at least, it is a struggle to find space at all, much less space that would meet some fundamental, ideal planning requirements. So you have thoughts on that.
Well, and I'll mention the magic word once again for you is data. And how do we take narrative and anecdotal information around the country and measure that, evaluate the topic, collect the data to you be able to make recommendations as you have an insight on how you take that narrative and the data you're going to be given, and then you're taking different states, different localities, and you try to have make recommendations from that.
Well, it's often the case that in this field we say that there's a scarcity of data, that we don't have enough information. The truth is there's a lot of data out there, but you all have it, and it's not in one public repository. And so part of this effort is to try and get as much information in one place at one time. Let me give you just an example on this topic, which is we don't know how many poll workers per polling place states have. It would be great to know how allocations of poll workers per polling place in a state. Many of you have that data in the state. We don't have that data. If you do, send it to us, right? Ways that voter turnout is projected, right? What models are you using in order to predict the turnout on election day. That would be a pretty important element in predicting flow and turnout and possibly lines. We know that the different states, different localities are using different models for that. It would be great to get that one in place, and then we could use those models to figure out what works and what the best practices. But at other conferences, when we talk, people say, well, we don't have that. And then I ask, well, do you have the number of poll worker proposals? Well, sure, we have that. That's the type of stuff that we want, even the most mundane aspects, because then we can put it into the same database with, say, the EAC surveys, some of the other private surveys, merge it together, and then get some information out of it.
Those are very good asks. It's going to be interesting to see, how many get, sorry, Commissioner, you have something on that?
No, I didn't.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to mention that when it comes to poll workers, some of the information I think that is informative is not only what the requirement is statutorily, but how many you hired and then how many showed up. What your recidivism is and how many of these are veteran poll workers, they come back every election, and how many of them were first-time workers. Because that can be a huge challenge to overcome when you have a lot of influx of new people into the system, and that's what we're finding in some cases. When you have someone who has had the ability to go through training, through multiple sessions and multiple cycles, that they maybe aren't as seasoned and veteran as some of our other poll workers. So anything that you have in terms of what you have put in place to attract poll workers, and sometimes that can be pay, sometimes it can be award ceremonies, sometimes it can be a certificate. I mean, anything that you believe assists in your state or your localities to encourage people to participate in the process and to also show up on election morning when we desperately need them. Because some of us can have the best program and we've got them all hired a week beforehand, but then election day arrives and at 5 o'clock in the morning, that's awfully early, and some of them don't show up. One of the things we have heard is for youth poll workers, for having people who have, there's the high school poll worker, and then there's also the college poll worker, and what works best in your jurisdiction. Because we've heard conflicting information in some places. The college students work very well because they're getting college credit. In other places, it's the younger poll worker that we're able to attract because mom and dad are making sure they get out of bed in the morning. And they weren't out late the night before, that sort of thing. So sometimes it's just down to the very basic of how exactly we're able to implement this from one cycle to the next.
I think those are really good asks. And what I've heard from the commissioners I visited with this morning is they really do want to hear from us. And one of the things I would be really saddened by is that we let this opportunity pass without sharing the information we had. The last thing I would like to see is a report that comes out of Washington that we look at and say, well, they never talked about that, they never asked us about that, we never had the opportunity to give input. And, I would just ask for a show of hands, quite frankly. I mean, when I look at the states around the room, how many of you experienced problems with long lines, what you would call long lines? Okay, so we have some states that raise their hands. Obviously, there's a number of states that feel like they haven't had that problem. I would also ask states who, don't feel like they had that problem. Maybe you could, share your best practices when you talk about recruiting poll workers, what you do to make sure that there are enough poll workers there, any innovative things you're doing to try and establish that you have enough poll workers and enough polling precincts, etc. Secretary Mollis.
Although I raised my hand as one who did have some long lines, I just want to get the opportunity to talk about a few things. First, I think I'm a good example as one thing that I think we're all talking about, being that I'm from a state that's probably the size of some glaciers here in this state. One of our biggest concerns is that one size doesn't fit all. So I don't want to speak for NAS, but it seems like that's what we're hearing when we meet. So when we're talking about issues and we realize that I have a problem in my state, that same problem that's functioning in another state is actually a best practice. So Rhode Island has some early voting when it comes to notice use absentee. Talking to a state that doesn't have any early voting, they didn't have any lines. And so my point is that as you're going through all of your data, there may be a very good chance that one size doesn't fit all. As far as Rhode Island, we had a few issues for the first time in a long time where we did have lines. And I wanted to talk about a couple of the topics that you have on your list of priorities. I found that out of about 500 polling places, we had maybe 15 to 20 issues of lines greater than an hour. And that was the first time this has really happened, at least in my knowledge of elections around. We've gone through, we had a House Oversight Commission to talk about why that happened, and I think we came to the conclusion that in 2011, the General Assembly increased the number of voters per polling place from a maximum of 1,900 to a maximum of 3,500. Again, there's still 485 polling places that didn't affect. So the question is, well, why did that affect 15 out of 500? We then found that of the 15, when you doubled the size of the polling place and then added a 5-page ballot, that definitely created lines of up to an hour. So the size of the ballot, coupled with an increase of voters per polling place, coupled with one last issue, lack of flexibility in the design of the polling place. So I know that I personally was in line waiting to get into a gymnasium for about a half hour. And then once I get into the gymnasium, I realized that A through M to the left of me had about 5 people, and N through Z had about 75. So I waited in line to find out that I didn't have to be in line. In Rhode Island, the Board of Elections handles the poll worker design. So I was able to give my opinion on it because we didn't have any input into the design. So looking at that list of topics, I just wanted to take a moment to say that as you're going through your deliberations, we thank you for that. For the most part, there's a good chance that one size doesn't fit all. In Rhode Island, we had lines for the first time in a long time, and I think it was a 3-pronged issue. Increase the number of voters per polling place, the size of the ballot, and lack of flexibility in the design of the polling place. Of course, I think if we had better poll workers, that could have solved that, but I still lean on the side of if the polling place is designed better, if maybe we had electronic poll books. There's a lot of different things we could have done that could have at least assisted that, but I still think we would have a problem with the 5-page ballot and the fact that we increased the number of voters. So that's something with Rhode Island, but I will definitely send you more because we did have a House Oversight Commission that had about 10-page reports. I'll see if I can actually email it.
Thank you, Secretary Moss. That's very insightful. You know, one of the things, and I say insightful, I even SIPHT, you will not CIT. So, you know, one of the things that we have really, I have concern about personally is that we have a very much a state issue that I feel like, and then there are certainly things that best practice might be shared nationally, but one size doesn't fit all necessarily. I want to make sure that the commissioners are taking into account that states have the ability to exercise best practices. It may not, what I do may not fit Rhode Island, Minnesota, et cetera, but that we can certainly share those, and I'm hopeful that what you come out with is a list of recommendations, things to consider, and not recommendations that Congress issue mandates for states to do this. I think that's a big concern among many people.
We can assure you, we can actually assure you on that point. The one thing that's not within our mandate is to recommend federal legislation.
Yes, Secretary Kovacs.
We did not have a problem with long lines during our elections, and I'm speaking for Kansas. But one thing that was interesting that happened that was entirely accidental or serendipitous is we had a number of changes that converged in a few polling places. In 2011, our legislature adopted photo ID voting, and a number of our 105 counties also went to electronic poll books. And in addition, the vast majority of our counties use paper ballots right now. And I went to observe the election in a few polling places where I expected there might be a problem with long lines. These were some urban areas in Kansas City, Kansas, also in Wichita, Kansas, in the prior election. And I was amazed if you had that combination of photo ID, which of course only applies to a dozen or so states, electronic poll books, and paper ballots. It was astonishing how fast things were moving because people were walking up to the polling table with their photo ID out. They were scanning the photo IDs with a grocery store scanner. Then the person's name and data was popping up on the screen. They were being handed a ballot in about 15 seconds. And then because they were paper ballot locations, not waiting around for machines, you could have 15, 20 people voting simultaneously because there's no limit to how many people. So it was just people just moving through so quickly. I couldn't believe how fast the line was moving in those jurisdictions that had that combination of photo ID, people having it all already, scanning the photo ID with the scanners, and then paper ballots. It was just really, really fast.
Thank you, Secretary. Comments? More members?
Can you had a show of hands earlier. It might be helpful. We did this not too long ago in another meeting. So we have a fundamental definitional sort of baseline to work with. What the officials in this room would consider to be a long line? Is it an hour? Is it 45 minutes? Is it 30 minutes?
How many of you would consider anything longer than 30 minutes to be a long line? Raise your hands. Okay, thank you. How about an hour? How about 2 hours?
It's absurd.
How about same day? I think that's fair.
10 minutes.
What'd you say, Lee?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. That's well, we got some customer service. People here, people have private sector experience too. You know, obviously at Disney, you know, we can't, in elections, we can't offer a speed pass. And we certainly can't have people pay for it to advance in line. So, you know, as you have traveled and you've been to the past meetings, you know, tell me what thoughts you already might have. You can feel free to share at this point about how we can improve customer service experience in elections.
First thing I would say is one of the things that I see that is lacking in the whole election process. There's no merchandise shop at the end of the election. Can't understand that. You know, as one of the lay people, the first thing I'd like to say is how incredibly impressed I've been in learning from all of you. The second thing I would say is how complex this whole election administration issue is. At first, I had this, you know, pie in the sky idea that, oh, you know, we'll just treat this exactly like you would treat any problem that you would have in the business sector, which involved customer service, transactions, or we like to say interactions. But it's so much more than that. So I've enjoyed not only learning, but I've also felt this pressure, you know, to try to be helpful. So to answer your question, Mr. Secretary, I'm not sure that I'm ready to draw any formal conclusions. I would say that what's been on my mind a lot is this issue around standards. And how do you think about standards? How do you think about standards that yet give the flexibility for election officials to react, and the one size does not fit all? That is a concept that I certainly agree with, but I've noticed that there are just so many complex factors when it comes to putting on an election that it amazes me that, you know, the person or the people that are leading elections actually have so much responsibility, and sometimes it almost seems to me it's asking a lot of some of the individuals to pull off all the things they need to pull off. So I've been thinking about, you know, how do we set these people up for success?
Thank you, Commissioner. You know, if we can, let's segue to early voting. Talk about that for a minute. Please raise your hands if your state offers early voting. Okay. How many don't? We have a handful. You know, in our state, we utilize early voting. We've got 60% of people participate in early voting here roughly 2 weeks, and their minimum number of 4 hours a day to check the open. And we encourage people to participate in early voting so that helps spread out the number of voters, and quite frankly diminishes any effect of potential long lines on election day. And so people like the convenience of it. You know, there was actually, we were able to save a little money during the presidential preference primary last year when there wasn't a contest on the Democrat side, obviously. On the Republican side, there was some legitimacy, but we had taken money out of the presidential preference primary. We took one day out of our presidential preference primary to pay for some other election-related items. And we didn't see a great impact on the turnout when compared to the previous general election. But we encourage people, and we encourage our 95 counties to do everything they can to get the vote out early. Because we figure it does also, if there's a problem ending any way with the elections in that county, we can solve those problems early on instead of having Rome is burning on election day and having to try to solve problems so everybody crowding election lines at once. But I'd be curious for how others utilize early voting, trying to diminish long lines or potential for long lines.
Could I ask one other immediate show of hands question? How many of you have early voted for more than 30 days? 3. How many have it for more than 3 weeks? More than 2 weeks? A week? Does anyone not have early voting on weekends? Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to hear, Secretary Thomas, you have something you want?
Yes, I come from the state of Vermont, and in the state of Vermont, this is to follow up on what Ralph was saying. We have one town or one city of 40,000 people. The second town is 20,000 people, and from there the numbers go down. 30 towns that are greater than 5,000, 150 towns between 1,000 and 5,000, and the remaining 100 are less than 1,000. So we have a real lot of small towns in the state. Most of the towns vote either at their town clerk's office or a school gym. And that's just the way it is. That's the only facility they have that's big enough to handle it. We don't have lines per se. Might be a few minutes, but at most, usually at dinner time or first thing in the morning when the polls first open. We do have early voting that goes 45 days, no weekends, but it's 45 days of early vote. And we have, but we actually, when MOVE came forward, UACAPA came forward and gave us the 45-day ballot distribution. We actually moved our 30-day to 45 for early vote. That's how we got to that 45 days. Our town clerks are independently elected. I have no authority over the town clerks. They operate the system. They hire their poll workers if necessary. Some of them don't have any poll workers. It's just themselves, or they have volunteers. Some of them pay $10 an hour for their poll workers in the larger cities. So I just wanted to say that it really does, you know, across the state, across the country, things are different. And, you know, Chris, I know, knows this well from NASAD, and I think that it's really important that we all know that the way the systems work are vastly different in the 50 states. And I know that, you know, we mentioned this back in January when we talked with you, but I think that there are things that the federal government could tell us to do in elections. I know some of my colleagues probably won't like to hear me say that, but the Constitution is pretty clear that they control the federal elections. But I think that there are some standards that can be set up, for instance, on early vote or something on voter registration. But I think that there also has to be some autonomy allowed to the states as well moving forward.
Please, someone.
In response to that, there's no question that there's cultural differences from state to state. We've certainly noticed that already as we go around the country. And it's not only with, well, for instance, early voting, although once you raise your hand, it means something different to almost all of you. Some of you refer to early voting means you allow absentee ballots or mail ballots before the election or no poll, something like that. Others, it's 2 weeks of early voting. Sometimes it's in the clerk's office only, and all those have big implications. So yeah, it is different, and I'm not sure we want to recommend one over the other and get in the middle of the state's business, but we do want to identify what works best and identify what we consider to be the best practices. And there's this difference in terminology goes all through the election process. If I ask you how many do provisional voting, we all do because of the laws, our federal laws now. But provisional voting is different in every state. You do it for different reasons. And so when we lump things together and say how many do early voting or how many people vote provisionally, or another term is what's an active voter and an inactive voter. All these things to mean different things in different states. We're aware of that, and it's one of the challenges that we're trying to deal with, because everyone is thinking something different when we throw out the term early voting, for instance. And all I'm saying is we're very aware of that, and that's one of the things we're going to have to overcome.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Hey, man, that was my whole point. You know, mail ballots, absentee ballots, vote centers, voting in the clerk's office. Early voting is different than early processing. Some states like ours are provisional ballots are illegal. I mean, it's not possible to ask a simple question and just have hand raising. It's kind of like those presidential debates, you know, the best practice recommendation would be a great service to the nation. That's a different thing than trying to figure out exactly how do we all do different things. So, I mean, your state's pretty high now. 70% or something like that are voting early. That's incredible.
It's in the 60s,
Yeah.
Well, Commissioner, that's a great point. It's a lot to say you asked the question too. You know, I'm as an asset vote to stand ready to be able to get you good data that we can use to help make decisions and make recommendations or what I would call suggestions or tools for our toolboxes in our respective states. You know, I'll encourage y'all to think about the questions you really want answers to, and let us help work through our memberships to get the answers you want. You want to know about early voting? Let's ask the question about how many of you all, how many of you offer early voting that's absentee only? How many of you offer early voting, but it's only at the county election commissioner, county clerk's office? How many of you offer early voting that offers more than 3 centers? And so let's think about the questions you really want answers to. And let's think as a body. Let's think about what questions would we like the answers to, and what questions would we like them to be asking us. Let's go ahead and take this opportunity to mention those items. I would ask the chairman, what else would you like to hear from or about this morning?
Online voter registration.
Okay. How many states offer online voter registration? Okay. So can I just hear me? How many don't? Can we have some of the states who don't offer online voter registration maybe offer some insight about why we don't? Yes, ma'am.
Montana, we've had a bill the last 2 sessions to try and get online voter registration, but it has not been successful, so ours is a legislative issue.
She's saying they offer legislation to try and compensate. Do you have any insight on why the legislature hasn't approved that?
Well,
Anyone else?
Secretary Hyde, we're actually, Vermont is actually working towards that in the future, but we just haven't had it in the past, and we have a new elections director, and I know he's actively looking at that as we try to overhaul our technology systems that we're using, but that's the future, and we still have to go get through the legislature with it as well, so, as far as the legislature goes, who knows?
Thank you, Secretary. Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
I'm from Wyoming, and it's a legislative issue also. It took me 10 years, I think, to get online filing for candidates to file their disclosure reports and to get them to actually file their application for nomination online. And why they don't think that a voter could register online, I'm not sure, but they're still held back with that. But Colorado's going to mentor me.
If we have some states who do offer online voter registration and have had problems with it, can you share those? And I'll hush all across the room, okay?
Actually, I have a question. Coming from Arizona, where we were the first to implement it, we didn't go to the legislature, we didn't pass any statutes in order to enable it because our Department of Motor Vehicles offered online services. And because they already offered online services and the MVRA designates them as a voter registration agency, they had to provide it at their offices. And we just simply looked at a question of semantics of the online Department of Motor Vehicles being part of one of their additional offices. So we were able to do it all through administrative code and administrative procedures at the Secretary of State's level, which that might be a creative way of interpreting it, but it certainly has worked very, very well for us. And for those of you who might be having challenges getting legislation through because that's the route that you feel you have to take or you need to take, and that's the counsel you're receiving, many states that have had it have a lot of documentation, so there's certainly some resistance. That it's interesting, some states that are considered red states think it's going to benefit the other, blue states think it's going to benefit the other party, so it's always interesting to see how it's being interpreted across the country, but there's a lot of data behind the cost efficiencies in online voter registration that's certainly readily available. But that's the path that we chose to take in Arizona, and it's proved to be quite successful.
Thank you. Yes, sir, President.
One of the things we look at is, what's the impact of various registration policies on the polling place election day? So for those of you with provisional ballots that are coming out of the ceiling, that really slow down the voting process as people move through it. And then obviously it takes time after the election process. Look at voter registration, and one of my pet things that all my members understand is that I come from a motor voter state, and every state ought to be a motor voter state, but they are not. So I'm here to say that probably a large percentage of your provisional ballots should never occur because of changes of address. And the motor voter agencies, the DMVs, are actually doing the job they're required to do under the MVRA. Those people would not be standing in line to do provisional ballots, they would be moving right on through. So some of the things that we could use from you are what policies, whether it's the lack of implementation by the DMVs, affect your polling place on election day. While one size may not fit all, when it comes right down to the voter's experience on election day, we're looking at X number of variables. It's not an infinite number. It is very clear what these are. The Secretary of Rhode Island made these comments about the facility, the length of the ballot, how many voters are put in each polling place. These are the commonalities that you're going to find across the country. And other policies may come in and impact those. So that's really what we're looking at. What is causing lines where they do occur? And conversely, where they don't occur, what's been done to avoid it? That's equally as important.
Chris, I think that's a great segue. I want to go back for a minute and talk about poll worker training. If I can, I'm actually going to pick on our court elections in a minute. But in Tennessee, I took office in January 2009. In Tennessee, I'm elected by the legislature, and every election commissioner in the state went from 3 Democrats to 2 Republicans, to vice versa. And then we had a lot of new election officials. So we had a lot of new election officials throughout the state. And then we chose instantly, when I hired our new board of elections, to invest in training and realizing that training can help us overcome a lot of issues. And Mark, I would like for you just to talk about how we've invested in training and realizing that you can't overtrain your election officials. I mean, and these poll workers, they can make or break. I mean, we can have the best laid plans at the state level if your election commission can become 5 or whatever number of election commission you have, your county clerks can be solid. But if you don't train those poll workers well, you're dead in the water, not ready for election day. You want to talk a little bit about some of the things you've done, Mark?
Yeah, well, the first thing we did, we created an intranet site where we put all the training materials on. We went back a number of years and updated. Most states have a yearly training seminar, and we did that. We had a yearly training seminar, and then we created a lot of documents as well. But one of the other things we did, we created videos. Because the thing is, you want to make sure you get uniformity. as best possible, because as it's been pointed out, you have smaller communities and larger communities, but there's certain things like the provisional ballot, it's going to be uniform anywhere. And so we created that video, we trained by that. We also did PowerPoints that if they didn't want to show our video, the PowerPoint was the same part of that video. So we've utilized that as well. We've experimented with some online training with some poll officials, and that's something we're trying to do now. So where a poll official, they still have to come through and set the class, typically an hour class. It can go 4 hours in some of the larger areas for our officer training. But in some of the counties we're experimenting with right now is where a person also can go online at the end of the training seminar and they can get a certificate for saying they're doing that. The receptions of giving certificates after someone's completed the poll worker training seems to go great. If you can do that by doing potluck, you can save money, have folks bring the food, and you'll be surprised at how many people comment on the food. That's the reason they're, that's like a family reunion or funeral. The thing is, you never get to see anybody until you have them, right? And so basically, we're turning it into the more family reunion, not the funeral time. But anyway, we're getting folks out there. The other thing that we did, we had 60 out of 95 administrators change. And once they changed, it also changed the poll officials who was being appointed and those things. So we actually set up a mentor program. And basically we did it by the voting machine that you use, because we have 4 different vendors, we're not the same vendor. And so in voter registration, we have 9 different voter registration systems. Because once again, and vendors, because once again, on the local level, of course, it all feeds into the state. But anyway, we meshed that information together. But anyway, the mentor program seemed to work out as well. And then basically we just had a person in the office who just traveled. But the intranet side, if you do not have one of those, you're missing the boat, because the intranet side, we get more compliments on the intranet side than anything else. And the other thing we did, I think that worked for us as well, is that we had smaller counties, mid-sized counties, and large counties start leading some of their training sessions about how they train poll officials. And of course, before they did that, we pre-screened their training and some of the things they did. In Shelby County, for example, Shelby County is the largest county, and they typically have anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 poll officials. But they set up a system that some other counties are starting to emulate. They actually hired professional trainers, but they trained those trainers, and they broke down their poll officials into groups of 10 to 15 individuals. For a county that size, it's absolutely amazing how they do their training. But not everybody has the resources to do that. But that's the thing, and I guess the best thing is just find out what works well and utilize it. The internet side, again, can't say enough about that.
Can you comment on whether you run into recruitment issues, and if you do, how you address those?
Well, everybody has recruitment. I think everybody faces that one at some point as far as getting poll officials. One of the things we're doing now is we're actually starting a college program. We're going out to the colleges and trying to get college credit for the students if we can. And it may be implemented, and this is something we're newly starting to do. But I think that the start is actually have those receptions after the poll officials have done the work. Because what we learned was, a lot of your poll officials, the reason they're doing it is public service, that's part of it. But the other thing is that specifically for us, the retirees is doing it after they're retired, they don't see anybody anymore. But realistically, that's what they'll tell you. We don't see anybody anymore. This is a way for us to see someone. And part of the problem we have as far as retention, when we were moving poll officials outside of their typical area, they weren't seeing people that they didn't know anymore. And once they started to stop seeing people they didn't know, they didn't want to work anymore. So that's another thing, we had to relate to the folks out there. But in certain areas, you're going to have poll officials. One of the things that for your larger counties, if they have 20 employees, or 10 of the larger counties, each employee is required to go out and get 20 poll officials. Now, at the end of the day, that's a drop in the bucket, but those 20 poll officials then go out and get other poll officials. You'll see that in the neighborhood too. Your poll officials become some of your best recruiters at the end of the day.
Yeah, we've seen a wide variety of training, once again, as we've gone around the country, but one of the things that really struck me is one of the meetings we were at, someone was boasting to us that And I think that kind of identifies one of the problems, and is how do you simplify it down to something. You're training people to work for you for basically one day in a year, and we all know that they had to face that problem. But since 2000, it seems like every time you put on an election, the rules have changed somewhere along the line, and so we're having to the training is getting more and more complex. And I think a real challenge everybody faces is trying to not only to get everybody trained, but to identify now what's most important and what isn't. We spend a whole day training what we call our team leaders back in Clark County, and we still couldn't get through everything. And then you add to that on election day about 10 poll watchers who are all attorneys who are in there scrutinizing everything, putting pressure on these people, and you're putting a huge demand on their workers, and I know you're all well aware of that, but I think an area that everybody needs to look at, and we could sure use examples of, is just how can you simplify, identify what's important and what isn't.
It becomes a family atmosphere, and we learned that by going out and visiting a lot of precincts. And you know, once again, it's the things that kind of astound you when you're out there talking to the poll officials. Like one specific county, they've even started their own cookbook now. I mean, it really is about the food. And if so-and-so doesn't bring such and such cake, you got a problem. You know, and the other issue in the presidential election, you have time to eat it. I mean, that's the other problem, you know, because you have so many people coming in to vote, but I don't have those specific numbers.
Secretary Kemp. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I had Brian Kemp from Georgia. I just had a couple of things I wanted to pass along to the commission on the topics that you've been talking about. And really one thing I think that you could help us with is making sure that there's a message out there too, besides all the issues that we're having to deal with, is really that the voter and the citizen needs to be responsible as well and be educated. I think some of our long lines in certain places were because of long ballots, and when you have a lot of ballot questions or constitutional amendments, and if the voter is not prepared for that, I know us as Secretaries of State work very hard to make sure that we have information on our websites, that we're using social media to educate. But also sometimes if the voter gets in the booth and they've seen a constitutional amendment for the first time and have never even read it, much less decided how they're going to vote on it, I mean, that could just take, you know, one precinct down to a crawl. And I think that's something that you all, and I know myself and the other secretaries, I think, would agree that we would love to be part of an educational tool to help, you know, our citizens say, hey, you know, if you're going to be a voter, that there's some responsibility on you as well to be prepared. As far as early voting, I wanted to pass along that in Georgia, we really didn't have issues with long lines. We had one day where there was a big county that did have a very bad day on a Saturday, but they immediately made changes. That was corrected. By Monday morning, there were no more issues, and I think that's the things that county elections officials and us work together during the election process to fix. But we actually reduced our in-person early voting from 6 weeks down to 3 for this presidential election. And we did that in a bipartisan way in the Georgia legislature because our counties were literally crying out to us to do that because of the cost of, you know, being open for those 6 weeks, having to have a dedicated number of poll workers in their early voting locations, and there just weren't that many people coming in. So we actually reduced our in-person days, still had 45 days of absentee voting, and didn't see any issues. So I think that's something that if there's a thought to mandate a federal early voting period, that may not be a good thing. It may be better to let the states work on that individually. Also, we're now seeing some of our counties in Georgia, because they have a heavier turnout during the early voting period, that they're now reducing the number of their precincts because they don't have as many people voting on election day as they've had, which helps them save resources, which they can then put into maybe additional early voting locations. So I think that's the flexibility that we need as states and counties to be able to adapt to what's happening in our areas, in our counties, and in our states. So I just wanted to pass that on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
you send out sample ballots? Is that a statewide, or is it left up to the counties, or is?
Yeah, we have a My Voter page where the voter can go in, put their individual information in, basically their last name, date of birth, and the county where they live, and it'll pull up all their individualized voting information, their precinct, who their elected officials are, what districts they're in, all the way down, House, Senate candidates, and so on. And then they also can get a sample ballot that they can actually print out that'll have every single thing that they're going to vote on. So there's really, no excuse for any voter in Georgia not to know what the ballot's going to look like on election day. And our counties have started actually just, instead of printing sample ballots, they still have those, but when people walk in and ask that question, I've been in election offices all over Georgia where people are now handing out business cards that has our MVP website where they can say, you go here, you can get everything you need, including your sample ballot.
I'd be curious, how many states mail a sample ballot to every voter? Okay, how many of you don't mail but you make available on your website? How many of you have a requirement that you just have to publish in the newspaper, perhaps, for the election? And how many don't provide any sample ballot at all?
If I could follow up on that, because this is something that we heard at other meetings as well. And it was good to hear the business card with the website on it, because I think that is part of the challenge, is that we may all put the information out on our websites, have it readily available, but then how does the voter know to go there to find it? So I like the business card. A lot of times we have to cut back on our budgets. Many of us have undergone some pretty dramatic cuts in the last few years, and sometimes voter outreach and education is the first mechanism that gets impacted. So being able to direct the voters to a website, and I'm also curious because there is, of course, still quite a digital divide. So when we talk about some of the rural facilities, rural jurisdictions, they maybe don't have such great internet access, if they have access at all. And when you talk to people who have widely dispersed populations that don't have access to the online services that we provide, how do we reach out to those voters? And that can certainly be a challenge. So I like the business card information, and it's interesting to find out what other counties or states might be doing. Sometimes maybe it's a county within your state that has some sort of a program, and what the states are doing to assist the locals in getting some of that information out. Some of it I know goes out directly from the state, but it's interesting to hear some of the additional mechanisms in place to direct the voters to the right place to get their information. Because for many voters, if they're not finding out what it is until they get to polls on election day, that isn't helpful to hand them a sample ballot and then 5 minutes later give them the official ballot. That 5 minutes is really not going to save them much time in the long run.
I'm going to go to Secretary Obi-Wan Kenobi. I mean, Secretary Gardner in a minute. I should have more laughed at that, by the way. So, but if I can, a lot of things we're talking about cost money. And I certainly want to hear from the commissioners that as you prepare what you think are best practices that states should consider, that you also have a price tag associated with that, so that those who read the report understand that these aren't just things that, hey, we think you should do, can do, but people understand there's also a cost associated with doing those things as well. Secretary Gardner.
Thank you. We in New Hampshire have 309 polling places, and we have the biggest polling place in the country. We have a polling place that has over 20,000 registered voters. Just under 15,000 actually voted in the presidential election. And we have among the smallest in the country, a dozen polling places where there are less than 10 voters. So we have the biggest, smallest. We have over 6,000 individuals who participate in that election process on that day in the polling places across the state. Over half of those are actually elected by the voters that live within that area that the polling place handles their election for them. And we have tried to keep the lines to 10 minutes or less. We ask all those polling places across the state to do that. The election that we had problem with line was the 1984 presidential election. We had 13 constitutional constitutional amendment questions on the ballot. And we had places that had lines of up to 2 hours. And we learned from that. And we've never had that many. We try to keep it to 3 or less constitutional amendment questions on the ballot, because it was clear to us that that was the reason why we had the line. We're one of the states. We do not have no-fault absentee. We do not have early voting. So most of our voters actually vote at the polling place on election day. And, you know, I've watched the stories and read or watched on television about the lines and read in newspapers about the lines in some parts of the country. But it is, in this day and age, you can have an event in one place, and the perception becomes that it's an event that's occurred all over the country, and that's not the way it is. So I just want to pass that along to you commissioners, and you that had mentioned how many people are actually working in the polling place. I know that a lot of the states aren't like my state, and I'm not asking the other states to be like my state, but we have our own traditions and customs, and the people who work at that polling place, for the most part, are elected. And it's different. We don't actually go out and hire people, recruit people. They're people that have run for the position and have been chosen by the voters. So they're, that's
Thank you, Secretary Carter. I know we only have a couple minutes left. I want to give the opportunity to our chairman, Ginsburg Chairman Bauer, any closing remarks you would make, certainly just to your colleagues.
Can I just ask one question based on that, which is, we don't need to do a show of hands, but does anyone have data from their state at a polling place or even larger level about how long people voted, how long they waited in line? This is in some ways the holy grail that we don't have, which is, well, and it's not enough to know that, hey, you know, that there was CNN covered this problem in this particular county, but have you done surveys that look at how long it took people to vote in different parts of your state? You don't have to raise your hand, but if you do have that, that would obviously be extremely useful for us.
Okay, well, I want to thank the members of the commission who took time from their busy schedules to be with us today. Mr. Thomas, thank you as well for your doing duties here today. And also, I believe each of you can play a critical part in helping decision makers at local, state levels understand that good, efficient, effective elections cost money as well. And we continue to have pressures at the local and state level. You know, it's elections many times where you don't have one of those this year, so you don't need money this year. You're always investing in quality elections. You can be a part of that. I appreciate your efforts and willingness to serve. Thank you for your attendance this morning. I appreciate everybody's participation.